Well, in my first book, I outlined 2 principles that were derived from political philosophy. The French principle was minimum necessary rules. It's kind of a minimal government philosophy. The idea being that bad rules drive out respect for good rules. You have to have some rules. You know, maybe you don't want to have too many. You can understand that because, like, how many rules do you want to enforce? You want to spend all your time running around enforcing rules? And the answer to that should be no, because you have a life. Then you have to figure out what the important rules are. And you might think, well, you know, who are you to impose your rules on your child? You might say, well, what gives you that right? And the answer is, well, I'm his parent. Well, I took on the responsibility, and so there's rights that go along with that. And second, like, who else is going to do it? What gives me that right? It's like, it isn't exactly my right, it's my responsibility. It's like, I don't want the kid to be a squalling, wretched reprobate that everyone hates. And, you know, if you remember your elementary school life and junior high school life, you know there were children who were very unpopular and who didn't know how to behave. And how about that isn't your kid? How about that? That's who you are to impose those rules. And you say, well, how do you know those are the right rules? And the answer is, that's bloody tricky, man. And that's partly why it's a good idea to be married, because if the two of you can agree on a rule, then there's some reasonable likelihood that it's an okay rule, you know, because what's the probability that you're both crazy in exactly the same way? One rule we had in our house was that you didn't get to be mean to your sibling. Now, you could be funny, you could play, you could tease even, although you had to keep the teasing on the funny side of funny and not the mean side, and the person you were teasing had a vote on that. And, you know, that requires a fair bit of careful discrimination on the part of parents, and a willingness also not to, you know, maybe you're annoyed at one of your children, and so the other child is teasing that child. That's meanly, and that's okay with you because you're irritated at the child. Well, it's like, no, that never happens. It's like, yes, that's why you're laughing. It happens all the time. So you have to kind of keep a clear head about this. The other principle is minimal necessary force. How much force is it necessary to exert to enforce a rule? And the answer is, depends on the kid. And that's an annoying reality, but it's definitely the case. With my daughter, for example, most of the time when she was a little kid, it's flipped a bit in the teenage years, but when she was a little kid, pretty much all we had to do was like shake our finger at her and sort of speak in a non-approving manner, and she would stop. Whereas my son, you know, he was much more determined to get his way. One of the things we did with him and with her now and then was, you know, if he was being a pain in the neck at the table, we'd put him on the steps. And timeout is a very effective strategy. And with my son in particular, it was really interesting to watch him respond to timeout, because he did have a temper, and he would, I'd say, all right, you, steps. And he'd say, I'm not going to the steps. And he said, I'm going to count to 10. You bloody well better be on those steps by the time I hit 1. And he'd go, I'm not going. And I'd go, 10. And he'd look all panicky. And he'd just run around, 9, 8. Don't count! Don't count! I hate it when you count! Usually, by 2, he was pretty damn close to the stairs. And by 1, sitting there, and then, you know, I can remember this quite vividly. He would sit there just enraged. Like, it was so interesting to watch, because kids, well, when kids have a temper tantrum, that's rage, eh? They're completely undone by anger. But it was so interesting watching him, because when he'd be enraged like that, I'd go say to him, leave him a minute or so and say, are you ready to get off the steps? Are you ready to have a good day? He'd say, not yet. And, you know, and then it would take a couple of minutes longer, and he would get off the steps, and he'd come over, and I'd say, you ready to have a good day? And he'd say, I'm ready to have a good day. And it was very easy when he would come over after getting himself together and say that, then we'd just go on our way, and it was done. And that was lovely, because we had reasonably effective disciplinary strategies worked out. We didn't have to fight all the time, although we had to fight now and then. We didn't have to scream and yell, and the emotional tenor of the house wasn't at a high level consistently. It was like there'd be sharp outbursts of trouble that were short and contained, and then peace again. And the aim was peace. It's like, how about some peace? Wouldn't that be lovely in your life? Some actual peace.